Today, I'm talking to Sebastian Payne, the author of this fascinating new book, Broken Heartlands, A Journey Through Labour's Lost England. Welcome, Seb. Seb's Whitheall editor at the Financial Times, born in Gateshead, and that's where the book really begins. Well, actually, it begins with the UK general election in 2019. First question, Seb, really, and we're going to talk through the themes of this book. It begins with the 2019 general election, an unusual thing, a winter general election, and your experience of covering it, and because you've been out and about in the so-called Red Wall, and you should maybe explain what the Red Wall is. You became convinced that something interesting was happening there and something seismic that was going to change British politics.
Yeah, so the 2019 election obviously was long in gestation because we had those couple of years of the Brexit wars in Parliament where it was like our whole political system was constipated in a way that you just couldn't get anything done in Parliament. There was no resolution to Brexit. There was no majority to anything. That obviously ended with the fall of Theresa May, the rise of Boris Johnson, and it became really inevitable there was going to have to be an election to get a mandate to get Brexit delivered. And it's actually worth starting at the election before that in 2017, because that election was when Jeremy Corbyn did much better than expected, and some people think came very close to becoming Prime Minister. But what you saw in that election was the right-wing vote in Britain uniting again. So the UKIP voters were, quote unquote, coming home. So the right-wing vote being split for much of the past decade, increasingly with people going off to Nigel Farage's party. So when they started to come home, you could see the Conservative vote was gathering in these seats in England, particularly in the North and the Midlands, in many cases where the Tories had never won before, and the Brexit was the catalyst for that. So it started to happen there, and there were 4 seats that meet the criteria of the Red Wall, which I'll come to in a moment, that went in 2017. So in 2019, I thought, well, hang on a minute, maybe there's more to this. Maybe there's going to be more. And the poster, James Kanagasorium, who features in the start of Broken Heartlands, he did this analysis and he called me up and said, look, you want to see this? I think this is really going to see a big swathe of England go Tory for the first time. And he came into the FT where I work and he gave us this presentation. And it was really compelling when you looked at the demographic changes, the economic change and all this stuff. So in the 19 election, I started going to these places. I went to Bishop Auckland. I went to the Vale of Clwyd on the north coast of Wales. And you could see that these places were falling out of love with Labour very quickly. And obviously a lot of it was Brexit. They wanted to leave the EU, get Brexit done in Boris Johnson's words. And then a lot of it was Jeremy Corbyn. But having not spent a lot of time traveling around these parts of England, not least since I moved away from the Northeast a decade ago, it really struck me that they are not what people in Westminster think. You know, they think of the North and they think of Coronation Street meets Billy Elliot. That's not what these places are. A lot of them have got more prosperous since deindustrialization. They've gone through a lot of pain along the way, a lot more private housing. And then so when it came after that election and we saw that 80-seat majority, the Tories' first majority of that substantial size since the 1980s, I thought this needs more examination. So that's why I thought I would go back. Now, to answer your question, you know, what is the Red Wall? It's a contiguous pattern of seats. They are often very much linked and hence the same a wall, and they go across the northeast of England, cutting down through Yorkshire and then weaving the way towards Wales. Now, I don't cover Wales in the book because you've got the Welsh Parliament, its own separate identity, but there are many similarities there. The 4 traits that we set above these Red Wall seats are, 1, they voted quite heavily for Brexit, well above the 52% of the national average. 2, they had strong Labour majorities in the 90s and way before that. 3, they had a conservative, sizable minority vote, but never that big. There was always a bedrock of a Tory vote. And 4, they'd never had a Conservative MP in living memory, with many of them never having a Conservative MP ever. And so that's the definition of the Red Wall. And that's what makes them different from just your classic marginal seats. So Darlington, the railway town, the northeast, that's often described as Red Wall, whereas in fact, Michael Fallon was the MP from there from 1983 to 1992. So there's a big difference between those that just flipped Tory because Boris Johnson was ahead and was ahead in the polls, and those that have these very specific traits.
The book is, I mean, one of the most moving aspects of the book, and it is, I mean, Isabel Hardman described it, I think, reviewing it as moving, is that you begin in Gateshead, which is the town where you came from, and there's a almost a kind of Our Friends in the North feel about the way that you introduce the book. Tell us a little bit about your hometown and why you have this connection with this area, what it means to you.
So Gateshead is, just as I described in the book by Samuel Johnson, as the dirty back lane going into Newcastle, and it's now become a sort of dirty dual carriageway thanks to the 1960s there. It was a very heavy industry town, but even when J.B. Priestley went there in the 1930s for his tour around England, it was on the decline then. And it's that classic example. You've got the big, great city of Newcastle across the River Tyne, and then you've got Gateshead. And in terms of its image, its economy, it always has a slight sort of resentment feel towards it. And I think a lot of the other towns that I went to, your Burnleys to your Manchesters, your Wakefields to your Leeds, a lot of these places had a very strong industrial past that made them very proud. But in the 21st century, their identity struggles a bit. My upbringing there was not conventional for Gateshead. It was definitely very, very middle class. I'm not trying to do I was born in a coal bucket like a lot of politicians.
The Monty Python sketch, yeah.
Exactly. And it seems that having just come from Labour conference, that's what everyone now tries to do to appear authentic. But my mother's side of the family were very middle class. She was a teacher and her sister was a solicitor, and they were culturally and economically, I guess, quite conservative. And they always voted Tory, even through the new Labour years. My father's side of the family were much more average working class, very Catholic upbringing, very much a hardworking ethos. And my first political moment I talk about in the book was the 97 election. I remember walking to the polling station and they were arguing backwards and forwards. My father was very enthused for Tony Blair. My mother was not. And I went to the polling booth and she still voted Conservative. And of course, the Conservative candidate in Gateshead still now has absolutely no chance of ever winning. And they went backwards and forwards the whole time. My father sadly passed away when I was 8, but I'm absolutely sure, knowing from his friends, some of who feature in the book as well, they all voted Brexit, both sides of my family, and they all voted Conservative. And that just shows how the politics of the Northeast have changed over the past 2 decades.
And you describe Gateshead. Gateshead isn't part of the Red Wall, as you say, but you describe one of the key seats is Sedgefield, which is part of which is integral to the Blair Revolution, isn't it, in '97, and was the Trimdon Labour Club will be familiar to people. It was where Blair, I think, was in the constituency on the day when he said the People's Princess, the day when Princess Diana died. So it's a big part of the 90s political story. How on earth can that have switched and become effectively, an anti-Labour area? What were the forces, do you think? It's partly Brexit, but it's more than that. It's a story with very deep roots. How do you explain it?
Going to Sedgefield was actually really interesting because if you can almost see the decline of Labour there. That you mentioned the Trimdon Labour Club, and there's a great anecdote that on 97 election night, when they were celebrating the victory, the barmaid is shouting across from this tatty payphone in the corner, "Anyone know where Tony is? There's some bloke called Clinton on the phone trying to speak to him." And then they were desperately trying to find 50p coins to put into the payphone while Bill Clinton was trying to get through to him. The Trimdon Labour Club is now a carpet warehouse, and Mirabella, which was Tony Blair's constituency home, was sold quite recently, with not a single mention this was where the former Prime Minister lived. So you can actually see the physical aspects of that ideological heart and that physical heart of New Labour just disappearing there. So when I went to Sedgefield for the book, Iain, I went to the pub that Bush took Blair took Bush to in I think just before or around the time of the Iraq War, when they went and had fish and chips, called the Duncowan, really nice countryside pub. And you're sitting in Sedgefield Village, and it is the leafiest, nicest place you can imagine, full of Georgian terrace houses and people running their kids home from school. And I spoke to this couple who were retired retired teachers. They both worked in Durham, which is about 20 minutes drive away. And they loved Tony. They loved to talk about that, but they just hated Corbyn, and they felt Labour was just out of step with their lives. And it's palpable when you go around these places that in the last decade, Labour has been very negative about the country, too negative, in fact, that, when Jeremy Corbyn talked about us being a society of the homeless and billionaires, then yes, we do have billionaires, and yes, we have too many homeless people, but that's not most people's lives. That's not the lives of Sedgefield. They're people who live in comfortable surroundings that have actually been getting richer thanks to Thatcherism. So when you look at Sedgefield, by the time Blair became the MP, all the coal mines had actually closed in Sedgefield. And the biggest employer in Sedgefield now is either the Hitachi train factory, which is a very high-skilled factory producing and servicing all the new intercity trains. And the second is the Net Park, the Northeast Technology Park, where they're doing graphene, advanced manufacturing, AI research. This is not the Sedgefield of the Blair hinterland. So structurally, these places have become more middle class, more naturally conservative. And then when it came to really the combination of Brexit and Corbyn, that was when the umbilical cord was cut. But I think Sedgefield is particularly interesting because that is now the bellwether seat of the UK. If Boris Johnson wants to stay in power, he has to hold Sedgefield. And if Keir Starmer wants to get in, he has to win it. And that is just a remarkable journey since 1997, when Blair had a majority that I think was well into 20,000. And he himself was symbolic because, he had that conservative councillor father. He was the London metropolitan lawyer. He had that Christianity element that you mentioned as well. He really captured that Middle England sense in Sedgefield. It's not, as a lot of people think, a former mining, a seat full of former mines.
Yeah, I mean, it's mind-blowing as someone who was a journalist in the mid-1990s covering politics. If you'd said to us in the mid to late 1990s that Sedgefield would become a Tory seat and that the Prime Minister would be Boris Johnson, then working with the Daily Telegraph, I think, and then the Spectator, with a Tory majority of 80 resting on the red wall of former Labour seats, people would have said, well, that's a terrible sort of comic novel that might have been written as a fantasy by Boris Johnson. It's not political reality, which I suppose it's always the example I use as a counter when people say that Labour is completely finished as a force and the Tories can just see the next 10, 20 years. Politics and history never quite works out like that. But what do you think it is about Boris Johnson in particular that allows him to appeal in those places? On one level, it's quite unlikely, or is it Boris Johnson's not a toff or an aristo, but he is like a character from a P.G. Wodehouse novel in most people's terms, but manages to connect with aspirational working class or lower middle class voters. Why in those places?
So it is really a question that I'm still not quite sure of the answer to. And I tried to put this to Boris Johnson himself. So at the end of Broken Heartlands, I end up in Hartlepool. It was not where I expected to end the book's journey, but we had that by-election in there. And that by-election is interesting because Brexit was well clear. We formally left the EU and left the single market and customs union. It was not a dominant issue. And two, Jeremy Corbyn was no longer leader of the Labour Party and hadn't been for a year. So all those people who think that these seats will just go back because of Brexit and because Corbyn is gone, I just say, look at Hartlepool, where the Tories completely smashed that by-election and won it for the first time ever. So when I was waiting for the Prime Minister to arrive in Hartlepool, we were on the seafront. You've got all these slightly confused people wondering what all these journalists are wandering around here, eating their fish and chips and trying to have a nice Thursday. The motorcade rolls in, he comes there, and I described it as the Pied Piper in the middle of a hurricane. The people were running out of their cars and across the sand dunes to get to him and to get selfies with him. And they caused a massive traffic jam just by seeing the Prime Minister. And they were obsessed. And when I sat down with Johnson afterwards, I said to him, look, you're Eton, Oxford, your life is, you might call yourself middle class, but it's far removed from the middle class of a lot of people in the north and around the big part of England. And in classic Boris Johnson's style, he came very close to answering this. And I said, why do the working classes love you so much? And he does his hand through his head and he goes, oh, well, it's the people. It's nothing to do with me. But I think, first of all, it's a bit of celebrity that, you know, he's very recognizable. He's been in the public domain for about 20, 25 years. You know, all the things he said, the zip wire, GQ car reviews, Top Gear, all that stuff is very ingrained in people's lives. The second thing is he's truly authentic, that like he just doesn't care really what he thinks or what he says. And the fact that he does that PG Wodehouse thing of getting himself in the soup, saying the wrong kind of thing, people kind of like that in a way. And I think the other thing as well is he's just a very refreshingly optimistic politician that people, not surprisingly, like the places they live. They like the country they live in, which is something that Labour has definitely struggled with, I think, over the past decade. So when Boris Johnson is going to Hartlepool and he's going to Sedgefield and says, this is a great place, we can make it even better, people like that. Whereas if you're painting this very doom and gloom image of everything's dreadful, isn't society horrific, people just go, I don't like that. Why? What's the positive reason to vote for that? And just to go back to Tony Blair for one moment, 1997 was so optimistic, that moment, and he was contrasting himself with the sort of tired out nature of the major government. So you put that cocktail together and it's very potent for Johnson. But of course, I think the next election, which I'm sure we'll come on to, will be very different circumstances, and I don't think it'll be fought on that same terrain.
I think they also like, don't they? They like that he is the antidote to Blair, if you like, and to Cameron to an extent. They like the fact that he breaks the rules, and I think, without getting sort of too postmodern about it, is that he winds up the right people, and he's a Marmite politician, isn't he? Because those who dislike him really actively dislike him. But those who like him, he makes them smile, and he winds up. I could never understand why arch Remainers couldn't grasp this during the Brexit process or during the election. That for a lot of those voters, he infuriates a lot of people who Brexit voters want to be furious. Let's classify them as the people who are used to winning in life. They're used to winning in education. They're used to winning in employment. They set a lot of the cultural rules and norms in the country. And he defies that, deliberately sort of breaks the rules or disregards them. And they find that sort of cheeky and intoxicating. And it's also, don't you think, it's the contrast with Blair, where we had a long period, probably begins with Wilson in Britain, Kennedy in the US, of politics which is very heavily managed and mediated and controlled. And there's a literature about it, there are films made about it, the sort of glamour, the ersatz glamour of the Blair era and control freakery and message discipline. And a set of rules that you had to live by to be successful in politicians, and I think to be successful in politics, I think a lot of voters eventually could see through that. I mean, that to me is a big part of the explanation. How can it be that a politician who gets trapped on a zip wire, waving two little Union flags with a cycling helmet on, that his career isn't over? It actually magically somehow helps him. Just moving on then to Labour. Do you think, I mean, how do you think Labour can repair the Red Wall? Is that possible? Is there a way back, or is it a lost cause?
Well, I've just come back from the Labour Party conference in Brighton, which is obviously the first time they've met since Keir Starmer became leader. And although I think his speech on the terms of what it was set was a great success, that he managed to break with the Corbyn era. He did a lot of good backstory and stuff. He took on the left and the Horn in a very effective way. You still come away scratching your head and thinking, why would I vote Labour? What's the positive reason to go for them over the Tories? And part of this is the ideological terrain where Boris has moved things, that he's gone, spending more, taxing more, and that does leave a question of where Labour goes in that kind of era. The most interesting person I interviewed about this, Iain, is actually Neil Kinnock, who is now 80 and obviously is in the House of Lords. But he talks so well about how the Welsh valleys where he grew up in the 1960s have changed to where they are now. And I think that I think the basic thing Labour's got to, first of all, has got to realise that these just won't come back. And I think a lot in the party are still in denial about that. They just think, once we've got rid of Corbyn, we've done Brexit, then they will just flip back to us as they were. Once you realise that, you've got to think about a whole new message. And the stuff that Lord Kinnock talked about in terms of security, by saying those old structures that helped you in the past, trade unions, the communality of, the place where you live together, socialize together, we're in trade unions together with a big paternalistic employer. We can provide new structures to help you around that. That message, and Claire Ainsley, who's Keir Starmer's head of policy, she's written a book about this and she calls it securitization. And you can weave a narrative in terms of economic security, 0 hours tackling 0 hours contract, all those kind of things Labour care about, environmental security with climate change, national security in terms of being very pro the army, pro international alliances. That narrative, I think, could be quite compelling. The problem is that if you think back to when Labour's had big election defeats before, it takes a long time to repair this. Yeah. And, this was worse than 1983. This was going all the way back to 1935. And the key thing about the Red Wall is whenever Labour's done badly before, it was the marginals it's lost. It's never lost places like Sedgefield, like Bishop Auckland, like Grimsby, like the place I visited before. The fact that they've lost that and they've lost the marginals, that's such a big mountain to climb. And then, of course, there is the question about, is Starmer himself, does he have the personality and the emotional connection to people that Johnson does to rival that? But we should always say nothing's ever for permanence in politics. And your point about, that late 90s image of saying what happened to Sedgefield and Boris Johnson being prime minister, it's so hard to predict where politics will go next. The big test for the next election, which I still think is most likely to be 2024, I don't buy this idea that they're going to go early, is has Johnson delivered? If you voted Tory for the first time, then your vote was loaned to the party. It wasn't given to them. And people want to see the new infrastructure, the new hospitals. They want, they've seen that Brexit has got done. I think that's definitely fair. And the funny thing about the HGV drivers crisis as well is it sort of plays both ways, that people don't want to see their shelves empty, but they can also see we're having a debate now about migration. And, and I thought it was Liam Fox who put this very well when he said, yes, we want to have more visas. We are choosing to do that because we now control our borders. And I think Labour's massively underestimating that people will quite like that in a way, because that's what they voted for in 2016. But the challenge for Johnson is he's great on campaigning, great on rhetoric. There's no doubt about that. Can he actually deliver? And I think, the scale of what needs to be done to these places, it's hundreds, if not thousands, of tiny infrastructure projects across the country. And I think that's going to be the challenge for him. And he can say, look, we've done some stuff. We need to do more. Vote for us again. And Starmer will say, he's not delivered. He promised you this. He hasn't done it. That's the kind of terrain the next election is going to be fought on. But I think it was Rachel Wolfe who wrote the 2019 Tory manifesto who said to me, people just need to have the perception that things are changing. You don't necessarily need to have a whole new hospital. But if people feel, I voted Tory for the first time, immigration's being controlled, society is changing, Brexit was delivered, the area I live in, it's a little bit better than it was, then I think that's a pretty compelling reason and quite hard for Starmer to counter.
Yes, it's possible, isn't it? I mean, I suppose Labour conference looked to me from the outside, and I've got a significant birthday this weekend, so I've given myself a great birthday present of not going to the party conferences this year for the first
time. Very
wise,
very, very wise.
But it means I've watched it from outside and consumed it mainly by TV. I suppose if history doesn't necessarily always repeat itself, but it did look a bit like Labour in about sort of 85, 86, and that then took them from there another decade and another change of leader to get a majority. So they had to lose two elections. But something could be different this time, which is what happens, do you think, if you get an economic crisis driven by changes in global supply chains, shortages? It's maybe partly Brexit, but there are huge economic forces at work in the world at the moment. It's not that implausible, is it, to imagine in 2024 and that would mean that the Tories delaying as long as possible, which can sometimes be difficult for governments. And it looks as though they're delaying, but I agree with you. It looks to me as though 2024 is the most likely option. But imagine a situation in which a voter in Sedgefield or a seat like that says, Seb, well, look, he came in. He's had a really good run. Okay, got Brexit done. There seems to be some, fine immigration, but look at this cost of living. Look at the place around here. He talks a good game. Not that much has changed. Yet again, it's just politicians from London, playing games with us. And what would it take in terms of, and I'm not necessarily talking about a Labour majority, but it wouldn't take that much to knock out, say, 30 or 40 seats, would it?
I think that's right, Ian. And the fundamentals on the cost of living crisis stuff is that, a lot of these places are car-based, and that's another thing that has changed a lot. That in a lot of these places that I call collectivized communities, where everything was, people literally walked or bicycled to work together. Now, a lot of the red wall places, people live outside of towns, either on new estates or, and they drive to their mainstream employers. So when fuel is going up or you can't even get fuel, that is something they definitely feel. And the same will be true with food prices as well. This, I think, just comes back to basic competence point. And that's definitely where the Johnson government, I think, has struggled recently. It's just that, if you're seen as being buffeted by events, that's not the kind of strong leadership people definitely want there. I think the question is whether the next election becomes a change election. And there is the great seesaw theory about when Britain wants to change its leaders, they tend to go from a dull to a charismatic politician. So if you think of, Gordon to Cameron, if you think of May to Boris, if you think of Major to Blair, it goes all the way back that when the electorate just decide, I'm fed up with that style of politics, I want to go to something different, that would play in Starmer's favour quite well, because in personality terms, he is the complete opposite foil to that. But on the other hand, if the next election is a more of a continuity election, a sort of 2001, 2005 element, despite, don't forget that Blair had obviously gone through Iraq, he'd gone through the foot and mouth crisis, gone through his own fuel protests, and yet still kept on winning big majorities. One thing I think is crucial to separate about these red wall seats as well as the other marginals is the Tories do better in the more rural, more prosperous ones, and Sedgefield is one of those. The others, which are a bit more urban, like say Blythe Valley, for example, or the Coventry seat, which they almost took, that I visited on the Broken Heartlands tour, the more urban ones, I think, will be easier to win back for Labour because they're better organised, they have more activists. And when you've got that kind of more urban struggle, that more urban poverty, that is easier for them to win back there. So my sort of default scenario is that some of the red wall will flip back, some of it won't. Because I think Starmer will probably have a message quite primed towards those people, acknowledging that, their lives have got better in many respects. They're not as poor as they once were. So he will say to those people, we're on your side of aspiration, to use the dreaded A word that Labour doesn't really like these days. We're on your side of aspiration, but we can be a good, competent government, and we will actually level up like we did in 97 with do all the long list of things they did within government there. That, I think, would be a real challenge for Johnson. But as you said, the Corbyn effect will still be a long, long time. He's still there. He's still prominent in the party. We won't forget that in a long period of time. And the fact as well that people really underestimate in Westminster how much the country's perceptions of the Tory party have changed under Boris Johnson. They don't think it's the same government as David Cameron and George Osborne. They're not even in Parliament anymore. And I think things like the Greensill lobbying scandal, that again helps Johnson put distance with those people. So when Labour talks about 10 years of austerity, people think, well, hang on a minute, this is a whole new government. And the fact that the cabinet was so different with very few continuity figures from the Cameron era. So in some ways, we've actually become the start of a new government, which could lay the path, for what Johnson wants, which is a decade in power.
As you say, it's an amazing trick to pull off, and it's also compounded by the fact that that Boris leaves no room to his left for Labour to occupy. There's a nice bit in the book where you talk about a voter producing a picture of Starmer taking the knee. And saying that that's why, without getting into the culture war, which has become extremely boring, that's why he couldn't vote for Starmer. What about Starmer himself? Can he connect in any of these seats and with these voters that you interview in the book?
It's a really good question. And I think if just to go back to his Labour conference speech, for example, I think before that, the expectations were, we know what his slogan is, but how is he going to put across that emotional message? And the fact is, he's not a Jeremy Corbyn where it is all about, the movement, the struggle, class war, all that kind of stuff, which was projected around in a lot of the Red Wall seats. I think the thing for Starmer is going to be, I think the most crucial line in his speech, he's like, I don't hate Boris Johnson. I think he's a trivial politician. And that is the core of his message, is to kind of say, I can be a more professional, competent prime minister just to get politics out your lives and get things done. But I think the problem is that's him. That's not the Labour Party. And he was talking in his conference speech about NATO and international alliances. That was the day after the Labour Party conference voted against AUKUS, the new defence pact with Australia and the United States. It's the kind of thing Red Wall voters love, that it's projecting Britain's image, its jobs, its investment, and it ties apart with two nations that I think a lot of British voters have a cultural affinity with. And the Labour Party conference voted against this with a factually incorrect motion that said it was breaking non-proliferation laws, which it doesn't, and would start a second Cold War, which it's not going to. And
to which the old Labour right would say, well, what was wrong with the last Cold War, which the West was right to fight and won?
Yeah, totally. And that value disconnect, I think, is the real problem, because Starmer will put forward what he thinks. And I think if it was just him, it would be fine. But you've still got the party, you've got Angela Rayner, and if you take the comments she was making about Tory scum, and, she was going around parties on the last night of conference saying, I have no regrets. I think they are scum. In fact, I think they're actually worse than that. Now, I wish I'd been more aggressive in what she said. And I think if you think of that, what does it say about people who vote for scum? And I think that logical analysis that, the Tories are bad people, if you're going to start from that basis, you're never going to win these places back. But I think Starmer's still got a long road to run. And the people in Conservative HQ who are plotting the next election, the one thing they always say to me is, don't rule out a big Starmer bounce before the next election, because of the cost of living crisis, the massive waiting list on the NHS and public services due to lockdown as well. Inevitably, we've got the spectre of interest rates and inflation, and all that stuff squeezes together. And Starmer comes along and just says, the government hasn't got a grip on this, much like Margaret Thatcher did in 1979. We will come in as the grown-ups with a different approach and get a handle on this. I think that could connect. And then, of course, you get into the specifics of an election campaign and what people want the next 5 years to look like.
It's possible, isn't it? And I've always thought that Starmer was a bit of a kind of ghost-like figure, and he seemed somehow watching from, I thought his party looked weird for the reasons that you described, the sort of failure, the Rayner basic failure of manners, which I just think won't land well with the kind of voters that Labour needs to reach. But then on the positive side for Labour, he seemed to become a bigger, fuller figure, also appearing with his other half, with his wife. He just seemed to be a slightly livelier, more engaging figure, but a hell of a long way to go. There's also the question, we haven't mentioned Scotland, but I just wanted to flag up that in the years when Tony Blair dominated British politics, there was always that block of seats. Before the Red Wall went, of course, Scotland went, didn't it? And it's even more difficult for Labour to get a majority. It not only has to rebuild the Red Wall, it has to take back Scotland. There doesn't seem to be any sign of that happening at all yet.
No, and I think one interesting thing is that I spoke to somebody in the shadow cabinet just before the election, just after the 2019 election, and they said to me, it could have been so much worse. And they had done internal numbers and folks, and they thought that the whole thing could collapse en masse like Scotland. And this comes back to the Red Wall theory that, when something goes, when there's a cultural movement, it all just goes in one block. And in some ways, Labour was definitely saved by the Brexit Party. If you think of Ed Miliband, Yvette Cooper, the seats in Hull, they could all have gone in a much bigger tide. And that is one thing that actually does worry Labour, that they may make progress in some of the southern marginals. If you think of, your Sloughs, your Peterboroughs, those kind of places where Starmer's personality and politics probably play quite well. there are more seats they could lose if the trends we've seen in the Red Wall do continue and those voters do feel that Labour is still not on their side. And I think it was interesting in his conference speech, Starmer did mention the union, did defend it, but it's been how many years 6 years since the 2015 election. Labour's been through, I think, 6 leaders since then. It still has no idea how to win back Scotland and doesn't seem to be making any progress whatsoever. And I think it could find itself in a very similar situation with the Red Wall.
Yeah. One final question just before that. You're watching Reaction on YouTube. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, just click the button and like this video. And also visit the site where you get access, if you become a subscriber, to my weekly newsletter on politics and all the work that the team does. Now, final question, Seb. One of the many things that I liked so much about this book is that it is, and it's difficult to express, it's of England. And so much of the media is kind of London focused, and so much of the reporting that we do as an industry sort of flying in to these places or training in quickly for a photo op and then sort of out and writing pieces trying to explain what's really going on in those places on that basis is tough. But it feels, because you've made it part of your business for years, to actually get out and about in England and to try and understand what's really going on. As I say, it feels it's of England. Do you feel, having done that, do you feel optimistic about England? Let's put the union to one side. But when you go to these seats, do you think is this a country heading in broadly the right direction, or do you feel worried about it?
I think actually a bit of both, Ian, that like having good, and you mentioned journalists going in a lot, and one of the classic reporting failures that we do in this country is if you go to a place, you get the train, you go to the town centre, and a lot of these town centres are quite down at heel. They were built for a totally different time when people wanted small local shopping centres. But if you're driving around like I did, I think I covered 6,000 miles in total while researching Broken Heartlands. You just get outside and you realise society and community is not based around these town centres in the way that it possibly once was. I guess the reason that I feel optimistic is that these places, they are definitely moving on from the nostalgia and wallowing in the problems that resulted from deindustrialization. Their economies have moved on, their people are moving on, and then their politics are moving on too. That's a good and healthy thing. The reason that I still feel a little bit pessimistic is that I think we've still got problems of people feeling disconnected from how the country is run. And at the end of the book, one of the ideas that I've come up with is to look seriously at House of Lords reform. I'm a big fan of directly elected mayors. I think we need more of them in more regions. But I think we need to do something about that English question, because I think part of the anger that had permeated through votes for UKIP and then through this Brexit referendum was people just saying, I don't feel part of this mainstream debate anymore. And I think the mayors have been successful, so you take Ben Houchen in Teesside, Andy Burnham in Manchester, Andy Street in the West Midlands, they're of their place, they're of their community, they're really good at delivering and speaking up for their nation, their locale, in the same way that Boris Johnson did when he was London mayor. So I think we definitely need to think about that to make people have that sense of place again, because we've definitely lost that. And I talked in the book to David Miliband, because remember New Labour's response to this was the regions, by creating regional assemblies and a regional parliament. And he actually said that sense of region in summer was really rejected by people, because who thinks about in terms of a region? People tend to think about the town or the city, the place they live. And I think we've sort of got the right formula there. But I think we definitely need to obviously look at this issue of low productivity, which the government is doing roughly the right things. I think just needs to get on it quicker. We need to look at investment to make up for those decades of underinvestment in infrastructure. But then the much thornier question of politics and political representation, and it needs to be done too. So I think if you can tackle that, then I would definitely feel wholly optimistic for the future of England.
Because the New Labour response was conditioned by the fact on the question of England, that it didn't really want to and couldn't really engage with it, partly because of Gordon Brown, because Scotland and Wales had been rediscovering their sense of identity. It's a story with a long tail, isn't it, from the 60s through the 70s, through the devolution movement. and there's so much national focus is on giving Scotland and Wales devolution, and Brown and others, and New Labour was dominated to an extent by Scots. Everyone forgets that Tony Blair was actually born in Scotland. So it was embarrassed about England, and its answer was, it seemed to be how it looked at critics, was to try and break England up into pieces, which the voters then, particularly in the northeast, rumbled. But since then, something interesting has happened, hasn't it? It's just by a process, and it's by stealth. And it's not a unified setup that's been imposed on England, but new forms of English expression and local expression and self-government are appearing. Do you think that it will require eventually some bigger constitutional reorganisation? Maybe, I've heard it suggested that you could make the Commons the English chamber if you wanted to be really radical. You make the House of Lords the chamber of some new, if not federation, then some redesigned union? Or do you just think that the British system is so slow moving that that's impossible to deliver?
I think, look, if Boris Johnson does want to put a real mark on the country, then I think he should definitely do this. And I wrote a column arguing this for the FT, saying that if in his next election manifesto, that should be one of the keynote things to say, that we will do a proper look at the Constitution, because, I think we're both quite strong unionists. And when you look at the situation in terms of Scotland, I think if you just leave that indefinitely, then you are definitely storing much bigger problems in terms of independence and not really grappling with that movement there. I do think that, I love an archaic institution as much as anyone, but I do think that the only reason to not reform the House of Lords is because it's too difficult. And obviously Blair himself would try to grapple with that, didn't really get what he wanted to do in terms of that. And I think that definitely plays into it. And as I said, the kind of thing I would like to see is a 200-seat chamber replacing the Lords. Half of it would be legislative experts who do, say, a maximum of 2 5-year terms, and there are people who do the nuts and bolts of dealing with the laws and examining them, and bring people from across the spectrum. The other half of the chamber would have representation of the mayors, and then from the devolved parliaments. And as we've seen throughout the pandemic, you can do virtual representation. It's not as good, but it's a way of allowing them to have a voice in the national debate and trying to address that English sense of grievance, which I think was totally stoked by the creation of the Scottish and Welsh parliaments. And it's Nigel Farage in the book who says to me, he could see when he was going around the Council of States, the Union Jacks disappeared, the St. George's flag started to appear, and as Wales and Scotland rediscovered their own identity, so did England. So I think you can't leave it indefinitely. It is hard. There are no easy answers to do this, but I think it's one that we definitely need to think of. Otherwise, that sense of resentment and anger is definitely going to fester.
I agree with you, and it's a problem for the Tories, isn't it? There's no sign yet, other than Boris Johnson making some warm noises about it, that he's seriously engaged with this. I know he's got a lot of other stuff on his plate, but the danger is, as one Tory put it to me, is that for the Conservatives, is if they don't do it, and this, the Red Wall is reassembled in some way, and you end up with a coalition government, possibly involving the SNP and certainly involving the Liberals and maybe the Greens, it would be the left that then gets to redesign the Constitution. So if the Tories do want to follow the logic of what's happened constitutionally in the last sort of 40, 50 years, they should get on and do something of the kind that you described. So I agree. I think we are going to wrap up there, but just to thank Seb for his time. Broken Heartlands, A Journey Through Labour's Lost England by Sebastian Payne. A must read. That's often said about political books, and it's usually not true, but this is true. It's a really, really fabulous book. So, Seb, thank you very much for joining us. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction, click the subscribe button below and like this video. Until next time, thank you for watching.